Story 1. I have a friend that has a huge scar on his face, like a straight line from his eye down to his jaw, and it looks like it wasn't stitched and just healed with a significant gap. Nobody wanted to ask how he got it, as it was kind of rude, and most people assumed it was from an accident or something stupid when he was a child. When I knew him better and we had a quiet moment, I asked him, and the story was pretty shocking. His ex-girlfriend hit him with a hatchet straight in the face. It broke his eye socket and his jaw. The wound had to be kept open because he got rusty bits into his wound. He knocked her unconscious and tied her up until the police arrived. I never knew someone before that had such a violent story to tell. My sister-in-law's ex-husband has a similar scar. He's from a notoriously hard family in the area, so assumed there was some wild story behind it. Turns out he was running upstairs with a plate of food and tripped. The plate broke and sliced his face open. Gotta say, I was a bit disappointed when I finally asked. Story 2. A guy who I'm close with was a very heavy drug user in his youth. I don't know the entirety of the story, but it was shocking when I found out. He's a pretty stereotypical suburban dad now. Another guy I know constantly told obviously exaggerated stories about his life, from participating in a violent overthrow of his country's government, to faking his own death to escape mobsters, to being an underground bare-knuckle fighter, to being embedded with the US Navy SEALs. The surprising thing was going to his house and seeing pictures, news clippings, and other memorabilia, basically confirming everything he told me was true. Story 3. Worked with a guy who I considered a friend. I worked on the East Coast and he was in the West, but we often had joint projects. We would travel to client meetings together and grab beers, go to games, etc. Even went to his wedding. One day, the FBI shows up at my door asking about him. Without going into too many details, before I knew him, he was running an extortion racket with his then girlfriend. They would target wealthy guys, girlfriend would seduce them, and they would record it and extort the victim. He's currently in federal prison. Story 4. Knew this guy from a small hometown. He had a mental disability that made it so he couldn't fully function. He went around collecting bottles from trash cans, and then cashed them in and gave the money to the assisted living facility he stayed at. Just a super nice guy. He even did a lot of cleaning and maintenance at the place. From what I was told, he always felt guilty that he didn't have to pay to live there, and wanted to earn his place, so he did everything he could to do so. Come to find out, he was a multi-millionaire. His parents were extremely wealthy, and when they died, he left everything. But he wasn't able to understand what that meant. All he knew was the kind people at the assisted living facility were helping him, so he helped them. Story 5. My first job, I worked with an older Mexican dude. Super chill guy, and he took me under his wing because I reminded him of one of his kids. One of the nicest guys I've ever had the pleasure of meeting. Turns out, dude ran with a Chicago gang back when he was younger, and told me a few times that he killed people and spent quite a lot of time in prison. Lost contact with him when I moved to a different city, but I ran into him a few years later, and he became something of a local real estate mogul, owning a lot of bars and clubs in my hometown. Never asked him how that happened because, honestly, I was too afraid to ask. Worked with a guy on a TV show who was a set painter. He was a Hispanic guy covered in 13 tattoos, even on his face. From my understanding, from people I know who have been in jail, those are not tattoos you get unless you've done some serious stuff for the gang. Never asked him about it, but he was a super sweet, nice guy. Really easy to talk to, and never put up a fuss about anything. Always wondered what happened in his past. Story 6. Not me, but my partner did some work for this really nice guy who loved hunting, but didn't have an arms license or any guns, New Zealand, which seemed odd. Turns out, a long time ago, his ex-wife was being beaten by her new partner and called him for help. So he went to help her and shot the guy in the chest. He went to prison for a while, and when released, he obviously had his arms license revoked and wasn't allowed to handle firearms anymore. Apparently, he was really open and honest about the whole thing. Not bragging about it, but happy to answer questions. Story 7. After my mom's aunt and uncle died, her cousins, their kids, started coming to our family gatherings because they didn't have much other than family left. I was in my 30s at the time and had barely heard of these people before they started showing up at our parties. They seemed like normal, middle-aged people. One of the sisters was unmarried, very quiet, and loved cats. She started to decline into early dementia and then died. While we were discussing her funeral, someone mentioned that maybe we could show some of her art at the funeral. I'm picturing typical amateur paintings. Then someone said, I wonder if we should contact anyone from the museum. What museum? Oh, just the very famous museum that had a bunch of her art in its permanent collection. Her cutting-edge, avant-garde video art. Very weird but creative stuff. She was an artistic genius. A curator from the museum did end up coming to her celebration of life and spoke about her art. He even showed us some that were digitized, so they can be viewed using modern formats. I'm so sorry that I never knew this about her before she passed. All the older members of the family knew, and just never thought to mention it. It was old news to them, I guess. Story 8. My best friend's dad was an inspector for the police department. Basically, he'd be leading all the drug busts. We're not talking about small-time busts. We're talking big busts the DEA would be in on. I always thought they had a very upper-middle-class way of living off a one-household salary. His mom didn't work. Turns out, his dad and his partner would go to a drug bust as normal. But if there was, say, $250,000 worth of cash in the house, they'd only report $125,000 worth, and the rest would go into their pockets. And of course, he knew how to make the money clean, and it ended up in the bank without suspicion. I guess it was about a decade before the department was suspicious, and they set up a sting where they had $200,000 in a closet, bugged the room, and saw how much they took and reported was in there. They reported they found $91,500 of the planted $200,000. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison, but got out after a year and a half. One of the nicest guys you'd ever want to meet, so it was shocking he was stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars. Story 9. Not really surprising because I had known about it, but kind of a surreal experience to actually see it for the first time. My dad and uncle made a public access TV series back in the 80s. It was a show of unrelated vignettes and short stories. But I was never able to watch them until recently, when my uncle digitized the Betamax tapes. It's a very unusual thing for someone my age to be able to see an extended amount of video footage of my parents and their friends as young adults. They're mostly retired now. These are the same people I've known throughout my entire life, but back in a different era of their lives that I really only knew about before from them telling me stories. I was surprised to realize how much my dad at my current age reminded me of myself. Same mannerisms, personality, sense of humor, receding hairline, everything. The storylines were very similar to how I would have written them. Story 10. I was being harassed and stalked by the parents of a kid who was in a marching band with my daughter. The mother was one of those people who bragged about their mental illness and how proud she was of being not medicated. It got to a point where I would find them parked next to my car at the mall. I had a very recognizable car at the time with a vanity plate. No doubt it was my car, and other places. I finally called the cops when they cyberbullied my younger child. The cops told them to stay away. That was it. I was literally on my computer researching lawyers to sue them when my husband called and told me to turn on the news. The breaking story was the husband embezzling over $1 million from their church. She was arrested with him for spending the money. We knew they were nuts, but never saw that one coming. Problem solved itself. Story 11. My grandmother's first husband died in Vietnam or Korea. I always knew this, but it wasn't until my aunt visited recently that I learned that he died when my aunt was 3 months old. So my grandmother, widowed with a baby in the 60s, then went to the University of Colorado to get her master's to support herself and her new baby. I have her master's degree hanging on my wall to remind myself that if she can do it, I can do it. Story 12. I met a girl in college who was gorgeous and wearing a really flimsy threadbare t-shirt that was about 3 sizes too small. She had half the class ogling her, but she seemed completely oblivious. Came to find out her parents were super religious. She was homeschooled and then sent off to some program that was supposed to eventually train her to be a nun. Her parents had been planning for her to become a nun since she was a child. She begged and pleaded with her parents to take 1 semester of regular college classes. Her parents finally agreed. Of course, she still had to live at home, and she wasn't allowed to stay out after dark. The tiny shirt she was wearing was left over from when she was 14. Her family was dirt poor, and she had gone through a late growth spurt. I encouraged her to take out loans and keep taking classes. By the end of the semester, she seemed determined to do exactly that. But I lost touch with her after the class ended. Hope she's doing well. Story 13. In high school, I did some volunteer camera work for the small town public access station. We'd film high school sports and various events. The guy that ran the station was an old New Yorker with a thick accent. He told us about living in Greenwich Village, hanging out with Bob Dylan and Seeger. He said he was the guy who turned all the folk singers into the government for being communists. After that, he moved to a small town in Utah to escape his past. I took it with a grain of salt at the time. But years later, I looked him up on the internet and confirmed his wild stories were true. Story 14. Worked with a guy in the 2000s, just a really tall, quiet, nice fella, and we'd shoot the breeze sometimes about the local teams and all. He came in one day with a big shiner, and he said it happened at his other job. I didn't ask. I later found out he was a part-time pro wrestler, and it was due to a hit landing the wrong way. He played an old-school heel, and his ring persona was so far removed from him that you had to laugh. My son and I would go to the shows and have a blast. Story 15. Was acquainted with this guy at work. A friendly hello and some conversation in the break room. He disappeared a few months ago. I lamented to another coworker how I missed our conversations in the break room when old episodes of game shows were on and we would talk about the cars. Coworker told me this dude had confided in him about the consensual relationship with his own niece starting when she was 12. I hope he's rotting in prison. Story 16. Coworker was also a friend. I was with him the night he met his wife. We worked a retail job together. One day, the electronics department got a top-of-the-line electric keyboard. He walked over to it and played impressive, flawless classical music. He had trained to be a concert pianist, but walked away from it because it was his mother's dream and not his. I knew none of this until that moment. A coworker of ours did the same, from a professional tennis career. Story 17. Had a great uncle who was really weird and didn't talk much. Was the crazy old guy that moped around town on foot for a long time. Kids bullied and harassed him. Dressed weird and never bathed. Turns out, he was a Marine on the ground assault on Iwo Jima and took some shrapnel to the brain. Caused some cognitive problems, and his body had trouble regulating temperature. He saw the original flag plant. He told us about it before it was really known that the picture was actually a do-over. Story 19. My girlfriend in college. Well, she was in college. I was working in the dining hall on campus. Well, she told me on our third or fourth date that she grew up in a nudist family. Her parents were hippies. They went to Woodstock. Yes, I know, I'm old. It took me off guard since I never met a nudist, but obviously didn't scare me off since we've been together for 30 years. Story 19. My best friend. Basically, we were just talking online one night, and he mentions, "Oh, my dad has 50 children." Then I was like, "What the heck? Please continue." Basically, his father had multiple different affairs with multiple different women. I think he's still on the run, so he has 50 brothers and sisters, like half-brothers and sisters scattered all over the US. I think one of them tried to contact him on Facebook, but I don't know. I did not want to continue asking more questions. Story 20. My mother. I always saw her as just a mom. Sounds stupid now that I've typed it, but when I turned around 14, my mother would slowly reveal pieces of her past. From her father pistol whipping her on the head, explaining her scar, to being gang in high school, to being every night by a family friend as a toddler, to the years of physical abuse by my father, and a lot more I can't think of right now. She has had so many face-to-face moments with death and extreme pain, but she's still alive. Story 21. This was over 10 years ago. One of my girlfriends and a mutual friend's boyfriend. Super nice guy and extremely funny. Obviously had a lot of money based on the gifts he would give her, and he would always pay the bill at expensive restaurants when they invited us out. One time, he paid for us to go on a helicopter tour with them around Martha's Vineyard. It was never very clear what he did for work, but all we knew is that he owned his own business in pharmaceutical sales, and had to work with doctors a lot. We just assumed he was really good at what he did, and was very successful. One random day, our friend called, saying that he committed suicide. It was just so inexplicable. He seemed so happy and carefree. Turns out he was part of a crime ring with a few doctors that committed Medicaid fraud in upstate New York. Had he been convicted, he would have been looking at many years in prison. Story 22. I discovered that my uncle's wife was previously in something that is like a youth police force. Teenagers who volunteer in the police, and she had an accident because the truck they were in fell down a ravine. She was the only one who survived, but she had many surgical interventions since then, the most recent in 2020 on her eyes. Story 23. Worked in a building in London Square Mile. I used to chat with one of the cleaners who was a really nice, softly spoken man from Colombia. After a few years, while discussing over lunch, I found out his last job was part of the elite special forces in Colombia. He went into detail of the price on the heads of police, military, and special forces. The bounties placed by the cartels were priced by the ranking. I don't remember the price of the bounties, but it was a life-changing amount to the locals. Constant fear of attack 24/7 was not a way to live for him, his wife, and his kids. He now mops floors, but his family is safe. Story 24. I was working at a little computer store way back when such things still existed. We had 4 locations across the state. I was a bench tech, doing new builds and service, and was regularly asked to cover the bench in the other stores for a day or two when my counterparts were unavailable. That's when I met Antoine. He managed one of the branch locations. He was a slight man, not short but thin. Stooped shoulders, thinning hair, pale skin, late 30s to early 40s. He was very quiet and quite shy. I got to know him over several rotations through his bench over a couple of years. He was an immigrant from Lebanon. His English was very good, but he was hesitant to engage in casual conversation. I believe he was self-conscious about his accent. I was dating my now wife at the time and had mentioned we were planning on getting married. Antoine was delighted at this news, and he really opened up, being curious about our future plans. Would we buy a house? Would we have kids? Antoine, if you're out there, we got both in the long run. He was a very sweet, gentle, introverted man. After we'd worked together for a while, he asked me for a favor, to come to his home. He had purchased new curtains and a curtain rod and needed some help installing it. Once we had it installed, he invited me to stay for dinner and prepared a delicious meal. I had asked a few questions about Lebanon, but was sadly quite poorly informed about such things. Antoine was a Lebanese Jew. He had fled Lebanon in 1985, but not before losing his wife to Hezbollah, as their anti-Semitic campaign tried to stamp them out. He talked at length about his experiences growing up during the Muslim-Christian Civil War, and then as a young adult, about the age I was while we sat there in his small apartment, when Hezbollah's hatred of Israel turned to his community. He was such a sweet, kind man. The hatred, the physical manifestation of his anger was very real, and I saw it for the first time that night as he shared his memories with me. Antoine's family had lived in Lebanon for generations. He watched his entire community turn on him and his family over the course of a decade, as the Muslim community was radicalized. Don't even get Antoine started on his opinion of the Syrians. We worked together for a few years. All those days spent quietly in the shop between customers installing Windows 95 and trying to decide what takeout to get for lunch, talking about curtains and families. Meanwhile, this man was still fighting a war in his own mind. Story 25. I've mentioned this in previous posts, but when I was a teen, we had a college student who was our neighbor. Cool guy, had a girlfriend, ran track at the college, majored in social work, psychology, and participated in a lot of community programs at the college. There was a specific program, I believe called Upward Bound, that he worked with that brought high school students across the state to work and learn at the local college. And he would take me up there and let me play basketball and other games with similarly aged people. He seemed like a genuinely good guy. Well, come to find out, he was using his community work, internships in his college programs, and eventually his professional work and whatnot to gain access to diddle kids. It was absolutely shocking to all of us. And my mom felt really guilty about letting me go over to his home and to the college with him, even though I was apparently out of his age range. And I have assured her nothing happened. Story 1. I answered the phone, and it was my aunt calling from Florida. My parents had planned a long driving trip to see her. She was calling to say that maybe now wasn't a good time to visit. It only took 30 seconds for it to turn into a rant about not really wanting them in her house to flat out insults about every wrong thing they had ever done to her. When the rant ended, I said, "They left an hour ago." My aunt said, "Let's just make this our little secret, okay?" and hung up. Story 2. I stole this tape they bought that taught couples some new techniques to spice up their sex life. They were demonstrated by two real people, so it was porn. I let a friend hold it, and he lost it. I'm sure they know, but I will never admit it. Story 3. Had skipped school, and the school called my dad to ask why I didn't show up. So he calls me and says, "Why the hell aren't you at school?" So I told him that I'm actually on a field trip and that they should know that. And he says, "Okay, let me talk to your teacher." So I was in downtown, and there was no shortage of homeless people. So I asked one if he'll pretend to be my teacher for $5. He sold it perfectly, and my dad apologized to me. Story 4. When I was 14, I left the house at 1 in the morning to hang out with friends in an empty field and watch a meteor shower, which I had ironically been grounded from seeing with my family due to sneaking out to hang out in the woods. I went out my window. It was difficult, and I needed help from my friends due to being a twig, and then came in through the back door at 3. Left it unlocked. Nearly got caught, but told my dad I had simply been taking the dog out, which he believed since I'd done that before. Never snuck out again though, due to the scare of nearly being caught. Story 5. When I was a kid, we were on my dad's boat far out at sea. He asked me to take the wheel. After about 5 minutes, I saw a big log floating, and I steered into it and hit it with the prop, hard. I had seen a cartoon where they did this, and it just turned the log into toothpicks. However, it didn't do that. We had to get towed in by the Coast Guard. Story 6. My super religious father has no idea how drunk I got in high school. I think my mom knew, but she definitely never told my dad, most likely to save me from the hell he'd put me through. Story 7. I got so drunk and one night, I let a raccoon in the house because I thought it was my dog. I got the raccoon out, but the raccoon ripped up the couch. I just flipped the couch pillows over. It's been a year, and they still haven't found out. Story 8. I lied when I said they repaid me for half of my sister's wedding dinner. My dad was somewhat forced into early retirement, and while splitting the dinner bill wouldn't change things overall, I did not want him stretching his retirement money to cover something I could afford to pay for in full. Story 9. When I was a junior in high school, I bought a dog at a flea market for $20. I rubbed some dirt on her, brought her home, and told my parents she was a stray I found at a friend's house. They still have no idea. Story 10. I remember the day you adopted me. I never told them. They gave me all the love that shaped me as a person. Surely they had their reasons, which I will never question, for never saying it during their lives. They passed away several years ago, and I will miss them every single day of my life. Sometimes parents don't need to know any secrets, because there's a good chance they already know or have deduced it long before you've even considered telling them. They love you unconditionally. It is your sole decision to share something with them or not. Story 11. I burned the house down and not the Christmas tree. I left the lights on without putting water in it. I was playing with the dog and we knocked over something. A spark was created, and then the fire on Christmas Eve. I told my parents it just sparked and started. My parents got a divorce soon after that. Not sure if I caused that too, but life has been really since that point. Story 12. Made out with one of my mom's friends. Looking back at it, I do regret it, and I'm not proud of it. She was super hot, but I'm glad it just stayed as making out multiple times over the course of the summer, and nothing more. We almost had sex, but fortunately I didn't have condoms, and so I turned her down. Ultimately, it turns out she was f***ing crazy, in my experience. She always seemed normal to everyone else, though. Story 13. I had a huge problem with alcohol. They might have been suspecting it, but I was always able to control it when I needed to, so they didn't catch on. One night, we were in a club, and I drank way too much, more than I ever did. So at like 4 a.m., everyone had gone home except for some dudes smoking outside. I went up to them and asked them which way is home. Long story short, I ended up taking a pill with them, which to this day I have no idea what it was. I completely lost track of everything. Next thing I knew, they were also gone, and I had no idea where I was. I freaked out. I was already pretty much out of my drunk mind, but the hours before were missing. It was dark, and I was in another town, as I didn't recognize anything around me. I've dealt with depression before, but right then and there, it just hit me so hard, I couldn't believe what I was feeling. So I just went on some long road until I saw a truck coming my way. Then I found myself standing in front of it, waiting for it to hit me head on. The truck stopped. The guy saw me all along and had just enough time to stop. What I'm sure about is that I wasn't counting for that to happen, but just accepted it. That is very much me in many situations, which are never this drastic, of course, that I'm convinced I meant it seriously in those moments. So, what happened is, I walked up to the dude and asked him for directions. Luckily, while lurking around, I was actually making my way back into my town. I still had to walk 2+ hours home, but getting in bed that night, or day, was the best feeling I've ever felt. So, yeah, I am not ever telling them this one. There's no telling what they gave you. Alcohol can screw with so many meds that it can take something relatively benign, like Xanax, and turn it into a monster. The severe and immediate depression that followed would make sense to me as some sort of mood elevator, but I'm not a professional, and I'm taking a wild guess. Story 14. When I was younger, maybe 10 or 11, I had been eating bagels for a week straight. They were so good. Cream cheese slathered all over. One morning, my dad said no more bagels for a few days, and I said okay. But when he went upstairs, I had a bagel. He'll never know. Story 15. When I was 10, I went on our old sailboat with my parents and sister for the weekend. When we got back, I ran ahead to the car while my parents unloaded at the dock. I fancied myself a locksmith, I guess, and decided to pick the lock on the trunk of our 1980s Caprice Classic. With a stick. I decided to unlock the trunk of the car with a stick. Well, needless to say, it didn't work, and also I broke a stick off in the lock. So my parents get to the car, and for some reason the key doesn't work, and we have a giant pile of bags and large coolers. My dad proceeds to fiddle with the key and lock, tries to pry the trunk open, and cusses for what seems like hours. It's getting dark. Dad is still cussing. He finally manages to pry the rear of the back seat forward, and there's a tiny gap to the trunk. I'm convinced to crawl through into a pitch black trunk and try to open it. I get in somehow. Eventually, I brace myself on my hands and knees, arch my back, push as hard as I can, and the trunk opens. We load up the trunk, tie it down with a bungee cord, and drive the 2 hours home. Dad is still cussing. I will never tell him. Story 16. When I was a teenager, I once stole a cucumber from the crisper to use as a I threw it out the window when my parents came home early. My mom was so confused that the cucumber was missing, which made me feel pretty guilty. Then, a while later, she was equally confused as to why there were cucumbers growing in her garden. She served those magic cucumbers to so many people family meals, church potlucks, etc. Story 17. It was me that pissed in the trash can next to the toilet, and not the dog. I was 6. They still tell the story to this day because the dog was infamous for doing crazy shit. Story 18. As I was packing my bag that I was going to take to the hotel with my soon-to-be wife on our wedding night, my dad put a bottle of champagne in it and said it was to make things go easier the first night. I just said, well, thank you, as I was surprised that he didn't seem to at least suspect that we had been having sex for over 2 years. I wasn't going to tell him then, and I never did. Story 19. That I tried every single drug I was able to get my hands on at some point in my life, except heroin. My former flatmate and I had over 100 marijuana plants in a hidden room in our building's basement, and we paid our way through college with our production. Afterwards, I did cocaine for years with the guys I worked with. My parents still congratulate me for never falling into drugs. Unlike my aunt and uncle, whose lives were destroyed by heroin. Story 20. That I suffer from ADHD and take medication and see a counselor for it, and have been doing so for the last few years. They're retired middle school teachers, but they're old school. They think that only a very small percentage of ADHD kids are diagnosed correctly, and that most of them just need good parental discipline. They're getting on in their years, not sure what kind of cognitive dissonance it would cause them to realize that one of their own children should have been treated with meds and counseling. It's really best for us all if they never find out. Story 21. I never told my dad I was twice in high school. Because the one time me and my ex almost had sex, he took off the condom and I flipped out. And me thinking I could trust my dad, I let him know in a really awkward way and he shamed me for it. Stood outside the Walgreens, handed me $100 like it was a drug deal, and told me to go get a plan B. He wouldn't even go inside with me since I was so scared. After that, I knew I could never trust him again. P.S. If you're a father and your daughter comes to you with something so important and scary, please, please, please be kind. Story 22. Long time ago, I chucked a pack over a prison wall for a local gang for some cash. The pack was intercepted, leaving the guys who hired me to think I'd stolen from them. Ended up with a bounty on my head. Moved to a foreign country at 17 years of age, and got stuck out there for longer than anticipated due to COVID. So yeah, they still believe it was for a massage course. Kinda like my dad. My dad was working for the mob and didn't tell his parents. They decked out his car to the max so that he could keep being their courier. Well, he turned around and raced it instead, ultimately crashing it into a boulder. The mob didn't touch people in the military, so my dad joined the Marines. His parents thought he just signed up because of Vietnam, which threw my grandpa into an absolute fit because as a World War II and Korean vet, he never wanted his kids to have that life, so his dad disowned him anyway. Oh, and mom later divorced dad and went out with a mob boss until he died of a heart attack. Story 23. I texted my mother's ex-boss back when I was 5 years old and asked him for an opportunity to return to her job because I didn't want her and my father to keep fighting. Her previous job was 900 kilometers away and can only go home for 2 weeks every 6 months. I deleted the message immediately, but her ex-boss responded and she took the job. I only saw my mom twice a year then, but her and my father's relationship got better. They are both now happy in retirement. Story 24. I was an only child, age 10 or so, with my mom, and I was tired of her working all the time. So one day, I took her car keys and threw them. I mean threw them into our heavily wooded backyard, so she would spend more time with me and less at work. The next day, she freaked the out, of course, and was downright distraught. She was eventually able to get a taxi to work, but I felt bad, so I went out to go find the keys I threw. Long story short, I couldn't find the keys, and she got fired from her good-paying job. We had to downgrade our house to a shitty apartment, and she had to work crazy amounts of overtime at a shitty grocery store, all because I threw her keys. I tried several times to tell her, but I just couldn't ever get the words out. Story 25. I was generally a really well-behaved kid, and I never got into much trouble. As a result, my parents trusted me way too much and would frequently leave to spend weekends with friends at the casino or on little trips. Most of the time, I just enjoyed having the house to just me and the dog, and played video games and watched scary movies. But one time, when I was in ninth grade, I mentioned to a friend that I had the house to myself the entire weekend. My parents had always warned me against saying that I had the house to myself around others for this exact reason. My friends convinced me to seize the opportunity, and we threw an absolute rager at the house, and invited literally everyone we knew. I was a busboy at a restaurant, and for some reason, I invited all the line cooks who were like in their 20s. Well, everyone and their brother came to my house that night. No exaggeration, probably over 60 people. The line cooks came and brought a ton of and alcohol and invited their friends once they realized we had a pool. It actually went fairly well, and I definitely gained some popularity points at school, and most of my friends and the line cook stayed behind to help clean up before my parents came home. I told them I had some friends over, which they had said was okay as long as I told them who it was. But they could sort of tell some shit had gone down, but didn't quite know what. Eventually, my stepdad found a cooler with a red ring around the top of it that had been used for jungle juice, and he questioned me about it like an interrogator. But I held my ground. They called my friends and my friends' parents, and they didn't snitch either. I got in trouble because they knew I had some sort of get together. But to this day, they have no idea the level of sheer havoc that took place that night. Story 26. My parents think we're close. My parents and my brother came to the United States with no job, no car, and no place to live. They left me in our home country less than a month after I was born. After 3 years, they came back and got me. I never bonded with them. I was a troublemaker that didn't listen to them. They gave me a good life, and though they didn't have anything when they came to the States, they lived the American dream and retired as millionaires. We chat on the phone every now and again, and we say I love you to each other. They never said those words until they retired and moved back to our home country. But I only say it to be polite. I don't actually have any feelings towards them. It's like I'm indifferent or something.